So we've been going through the laws of reading from the Torah. We began by speaking about how a Torah is brought out and then how a person is given an aliyah. We continued by speaking about who receives an aliyah, and then we continued yesterday. We mentioned that there's a whole discussion of how many verses actually constitutes an aliyah, and I said that you're welcome to read yourself, as today we can just reference the Siddur or the Chumash to know how the different aliyahs are divided up in the Torah. And today we will speak about final laws regarding the Torah, such as just a moment. How we conclude the reading of the Torah, and what to do if there is no Torah present. So we're up to section 25. Let me share the screen. Okay. So after completing Kriyas HaTorah, reading from the Torah, a half Kaddish is recited, and the Sefer Torah is raised as follows. So if you've ever gotten Hagbah or you plan on getting Hagbah, here's your tutorial. The one who raises it opens the Torah so that 3 columns of writing are revealed. So you should try to have at least 3 columns opened. He then displays it to his right and left, to those in front and back of him. So then you would actually turn all the way to the right and all the way to the left, so that people on all sides can actually see the Torah from all sides, from wherever they are. That's why you are raising it, so that it can be seen by everybody, as it is a mitzvah for everyone to see the Torah. At this time we say the Torah is then rolled up. It is a mitzvah that it be rolled up so that the seam be centered between the 2 rolls. Why is that? In case there's strain, so that way rather than the actual parchment getting ripped, if you roll it with the seam in the center, if for whatever reason there's strain, instead the tear will go along the seam. So remember, the Torah is made up of a whole lot of independent pieces of leather, of parchment, and they are sewed together. So you want to have that point in the middle, so if there is too much strain, you can see the tear would be along the seam and not anywhere else. The Torah should be rolled until the nearest seam is located in middle. That is, if the seam preceding the part read is nearest, it should be rolled in that direction. And if the seam after the part read is nearest, it should be rolled in that direction. Meaning, in the way that takes the least amount of time, whichever seam is closest, roll your way to that seam so that you can, so that it will be in the middle in an easy way. Because it is best to minimize the rolling out of respect to the Sefer Torah. So that is as far as Hagbah. Every reading of the Torah is followed by a half Kaddish, except at Mincha of Shabbos and at Mincha of a fast day, where we rely on the Kaddish that is said before the Amidah. So actually, this depends on communities. What we've just read over here in some Ashkenazi shuls, they make a point of actually the moment the Torah finishes being read and it's wrapped up, then Kaddish will start, and it's said very slowly, so that by the time they finish Kaddish, it's right before the silent Amidah. In other communities, they would still say the Kaddish earlier, but the idea is that at these occasions, you don't need to say 2 Kaddishim in such near proximity. Rather, 1 Kaddish is recited either right before the Amidah or right after reading from the Torah. But as a rule, anytime we read from the Torah, we say Kaddish. This is an exception. As soon as the Torah is finished, we say a half Kaddish. On Mondays and Thursdays, after the raising of the Torah, the Chazan says a Yehi Ratzon. The congregation should listen and answer Amen. And on days when Tachton is omitted, this Yehi Ratzon is also not said. That also varies from community to community. In the Great Park, this Yehi Ratzon is said. In Chabad communities, it's not. I don't have more information for you on that at this moment. After the Yehi Ratzon is said, the Torah is returned to the Aron Kaddish, to the Ark, and it is a mitzvah for every person before whom the Torah passes, as well as the one who raised it and the one who rolled it up, to accompany the Torah to the Ark. So we're all familiar with kissing the Torah, but really what the Gemara speaks about is accompanying the Torah. So for starters, if you got Hagbah Glila, rather than leave before the Torah leaves, stick around, let the Torah leave, and then you could follow the Torah behind it. So the Torah has an entourage, like a king, being escorted back to the Aron Kaddish. And I was lucky this morning to be able to participate in my first minyan. It was very special. We were so excited that we even said Hallel at the end with a bracha. It happens to be Rosh Chodesh, but yes, we said Hallel. And this is just a minyan that had been arranged at another location with all the guidelines in place. And actually, at this point, we can't kiss the Torah because we are avoiding all physical contact. But we were able to accompany the Torah 1 or 2 steps, each from our own places, and that way still show our endearment to the Torah, not by kissing it, but by following it. Just as I said, it was just 1 or 2 steps in a way that it didn't cause people a lack of social distancing under these COVID circumstances. Okay, what happens if there is no Torah? When the Torah is unavailable, then one should read aloud from a chumash, and the congregation could listen, so that the mitzvah of Kriya not be forgotten. This is actually up for debate, whether it is okay to read from a chumash in the presence of a minyan. But as I mentioned at the beginning of this class, I don't have more information for you on that at this moment. But that may be done. You would ask your local Orthodox rabbi. A minyan that is praying and has no Torah to read. So this is quite interesting. A Torah is so respected that it cannot be transferred easily. It can only be transferred with tremendous respect. So if you have a minyan that's davening and there is no Torah to read from, a Torah may not be brought to them for the purpose of one Torah reading, even if they are incarcerated in prison, meaning the Torah is like a king, and we can't just take the Torah around wherever we want. This applies even for Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, unless preparations were made in advance, as if it wasn't just like, let's grab the Torah and take it, but rather it was planned in advance and set up to have an ark or a box or a place was set aside for the Torah. If the Torah was given its designated room to reside in during the duration of this minyan, then it is permitted to bring the Torah out, bring the Torah to this location. I remember actually when I was yeshiva in Israel, so it once happened that there was one person that had the key or the codes to the Aron Kaddish, and every day it was his, or maybe 2 people, it was their job to unlock the Aron Kaddish. And one day, neither of those 2 people were around, and we had everybody in yeshiva wanted to daven mincha, but the Aron Kaddish was locked. So literally a block away, there was another shul, and we wanted to just borrow their Torah to bring it over to the yeshiva and read, and then to return it. And the rabbi over there wouldn't let. And he said, if you need the Torah, come read it over here. And we said, no, we can't bring the whole yeshiva this side. And there was a whole lot of Talmudic debate going on over there. And he ended up saying that if a minyan of people will come and they will accompany the Torah as a minyan, then he will allow his Torah to be transferred down the roads to be used by the yeshiva. And that's what we did. I think there are different opinions about that, but it's an interesting halacha that because of the holiness and the greatness of the Torah, provisions need to be in place in order for it to be moved from one place to another. If there is an esteemed person who is ill, then under those circumstances it is permitted to bring it, even if it is only for the purpose of reading from the Torah that one time. Others maintain that for an esteemed person, even if he is not ill, or for an ill person, even if he is not esteemed, it is permitted. So as I said, there's a lot of debate as far as when exactly the Torah can and can't be transferred. Ask your local Orthodox rabbi, but for the purpose of this year, it's understanding the holiness and greatness of the Torah that things would need to be established in order for a Torah to be transferred on a temporary basis. The lenient opinion may be followed on the Shabbos when Parshas Zachar or the Shabbos when Parshas Parah are read. So there's once or twice a year when it actually is a mitzvah, a biblical mitzvah to read from the Torah. The rest of the year, the Torah reading was instituted by different people at different times, by Moshe and those that followed him. But it's not one of the 613 mitzvahs. It's something that was instituted at a later time, and obviously is very dear to us. But there are one or two occasions of the year where it is actually a biblical mitzvah to read from the Torah. And if it is at that particular point of the year, these parshas are around Purim time, a little bit before Purim, then that itself would give enough reason for us to be able to transfer the Torah, even for one reading, because some maintain that these two parashas are obligatory, amita araisa. So we've concluded the process of reading from the Torah, from taking the Torah out from the ark, getting an aliyah, how to get an aliyah, who we can call up, what happens if you called up the wrong person, how exactly we read from the Torah. As we mentioned yesterday, it always starts on a good note, it always ends on a good note. And finally, we discussed today how the Torah is returned to the ark. And the next section deals with if there are mistakes that are found in the Torah. So I'm going to see how best this could be done, because this could be quite complex for the average layman. So stay tuned. Perhaps I might suggest that you could read this by yourself if you'd like, and then we could move on to the end of the davening, which will bring us to the end of this entire section of the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch, which has gone through all of the prayers, all of the morning prayers through the course of the davening. And what would follow then would be the mourner's Kaddish, which even if you're not a mourner, would be quite relevant to know how this is done when there's a mourner in our midst. Thank you for joining us, and wishing you a wonderful Shabbos, and look forward to see you, please God, next week.